Now, the corpus of texts that I'll be talking about today is not as well known among classicists as it should be. And it's a corpus of texts written in the Middle Irish language between about 1050 and 1250, though it continues on rather later than that. It's a corpus in which classical material, specifically heroic literature, usually heroic poetry in Latin, is turned into highly wrought and artistic Irish language prose in a style and genre and level that's normally more familiarly associated in Irish with narrative eulogies of heroic kings from the indigenous tradition, the Cath genre, the battle narrative genre. Now, to give you a sense of the major texts in this corpus, there's Tuggle 3, which I'll be talking about today, which is a narrative of the Trojan War, based ultimately on the pseudo-historical account by Darius Phrygius, the Excidio Troiae. There's Scala Alexander, which is a life of Alexander, based on an unidentified version of the text better known as De Proides, and Alexander's letter to Aristotle and other associated texts. And then we have three texts which are based on Roman epic, Impacta Aeneasa from the Aeneid of Virgil, Tuggle na Tebe from the Thebaid of Statius, and In Cathcairge from Lucan's Civil War. Now, all of these texts originate in classical sources of sometimes similar, sometimes different kinds. They're all recreated, they all assimilate themselves to a single genre in Irish with a similar stylistic level and similar linguistic resources and a kind of Kunstsprache, a kind of artistic speech and a repertoire of metaphors, and rhetorical tricks, rhetorical tropes, and so on, which is uniquely their own. The funny thing is that in important ways, although they assimilate to a single genre, a single corpus, they're very different. Now, the last three in that list, the so-called Irish Aeneid, Irish Thebaid, and Irish Lucan, are each based on a single source text in Latin. The manuscript transmission of each of the three texts is pretty well fixed. I mean, it's pretty stable, suggesting that we're looking in each case at a single campaign of translation and recreation by a single scholar or a team of scholars. Now, there are differences. In Cathcairge in particular has highly wrought similes, which the other two don't have so much, and also puts in exuberant new sections that aren't present in the original. Tuggle 3, probably the oldest in this series, is the hardest and, if you like, the joker in the pack, and it's the one that I'll be talking about today. What's surprising about it is not just that it has such a different relationship with its source. It begins from the emaciated, brief, unadorned, pseudo-eyewitness prose account of Darius Phrygius and expands itself into what really reads like a prose poem at times, a text of astonishing depth and variety and vigor. Additionally, it differs from the others in that it develops markedly over time. From the time that the original text of Darius Phrygius was used as the skeleton for an Irish text, probably around 1050, though that's matter for guesswork, the text goes through multiple recensions in which it is reimagined, recreated, and dramatically expanded. One of these is a narrative poem, Donna Choganna 3, and the other three are known as Recension 1, Recension 2, and Recension 3. I've put Recension 3 in green there because it's my main interest. Recensions 1 and 2 were published in the 1880s by the great Whitley Stokes and have been published on and studied from time to time since. But recension 3, dating from around 1200, is so long, so complex, and so challenging that everyone who has sought to edit it and publish it has died too soon. That has been going on since Stokes's time in the 1880s. He declared, in fact, in his edition of Recension 2, which was published from Calcutta in 1881, where he lived and worked, he wrote about his plan to publish the later recension, but he never made it, and neither did anyone else who's done it. My colleague Donegal Hay did a transcription of part of it in 1979, and I published the prologue, which is mostly apocryphal material concerning Old Testament figures, especially Cain, Abel, and the sons of Noah, in 2014. But the rest is the challenge that remains. Now, how do you get from the brief, emaciated Trojan War narrative of Darius Phrygius to the extraordinary, inflated, and immensely complex, I'd almost call it pseudo-epic text that Toggle 3 becomes? Well, the compositional structure that informs it can be seen already in action in the first recension, where you get stylistic expansions, decorative scenes that are added in. For example, the arrival of the Greek fleet at Troy, which is just a sentence or two in Darius Phrygius, becomes a thousands of lines long messenger speech episode in Toggle 3. A messenger comes to the king of Troy, tells him in riddling language about the extraordinary things that he's seen, and the king interprets each of them. The great clouds that he's seen is the breath of the heroes that they're gasping out of themselves as they advance, and so on. That's expansion. Something else, perhaps more interesting, more different, is also involved, and that is the addition of new episodes that can be seen as pendants to the original text. In the slide you're seeing at the moment, the main narrative of the original Latin of Darius is represented by the yellow line going across the screen. So the principal episodes, just at the very beginning of the Trojan War here, according to Darius, are, first of all, that Peleus got Jason to go on the quest for the Golden Fleece. Jason, urged on by the quest for honor, went to sail for the fleece. They stopped off at Troy, where Laomedon insulted them. Hercules wanted to take revenge immediately, but Jason calmed him down and they sailed on. In Toggle 3, not only is each of those episodes expanded and deepened and dramatized, but when the Argo is first mentioned, there's a long digression, a learned digression on the building of the Argo, which leads into a kind of scholastic discussion of why was it named Argo. When it's explained that they're sailing for the Golden Fleece, the origins of the ram that carried Phrixus and Hele across the Hellespont to Colchis form the subject of another digression, based in this case on the Philargyrian commentary on the Eclogues and Georgics of Virgil. That can actually be proved through a significant error. And that then goes to another digression, which I haven't been able to find the source for. Why was the ram golden? And this leads into a sub-narrative about a quarrel between Fama and Erinis, trying to prove which of them was the more powerful goddess. Similarly, when Hercules wants revenge, this becomes the cue for a digression into a list of Hercules' earlier exploits. A hero that had killed the Lernaean Hydra, a hero who had done this, who had done that. You'd hardly expect him to put up with an insult from the king of Troy. Now, as I say, this digressive structure is found already in the first recension, There are similar new digressive episodes, though fewer of them, added in Recension 2 in the Book of Leinster, which is kind of at an angle to the others. And more are added again in slightly later language, slightly later verb forms, but in a very similar style and register in Recension 3. Now, this notion that the same compositional strategy is being expanded and developed and continued from century to century, it must be by a whole series of scholars in a succession. This project is most closely paralleled in medieval Irish literature by the Leabhar Gabhála, the so-called Book of Invasions, an account of the what we would call mythical, what they would call euhemerizing historical prehistory of the Irish nation itself. You can see that same process going on there. And I think this proves that in some sense, Tugal 3 is becoming canonical in the, if you like, the growing corpus of Irish literature that is found in the great manuscripts, first of the 12th century, and then those that survive from the late 14th and 15th. As I continue, could I ask one or two of you, please, perhaps if Valerie James, since I can see your picture, would, if you would, a couple of you wouldn't mind sharing your picture with me, that will encourage me to be sure that I can still stay in touch with you, because connections sometimes break in the west of Ireland. Catherine, I can see you there, and if you smile every so often or move your head, I'll know that the connection isn't broken. Thank you. Thank you very much. Valerie, hi. So I'll carry on then. We see the compositional logic that builds this text together. And I'm now going to take you to the unpublished episode that I'm going to study today, and of which I'm working on an edition at the moment. It occupied the happiest days of a research sabbatical that I had at the height of lockdown, and I will try to share some of it with you. I need to digress for a moment, because this is going to be the story of the Lemnian women. And I don't know about you, but I always forget these myths if I've left them aside for a while, if I ever knew them properly. So here it goes. I'm going to summarize this story, which our author will say about 1200 draws into the Trojan War narrative. I'm taking it from the Second Vatican Mythographer, which is a mythographic source that we know was used by some, at least, of the compilers of Tugal 3. So it'll be a good example of the standard. The story begins when Venus curses the women of the island of Lemnos to smell like goats. Their men reject them as a result and go to Thrace on a raid in search of other women. The women of Lemnos conspire to murder their men on their return, which they do, all but one. Now, the motifs will become familiar. Hypsipyle, the king's daughter, secretly warns her father, Thoas, the king, of the slaughter by the women that's going on, and she spirits him off the island. She pretends to have been in with the other murderers, and afterwards becomes their leader. In due course, after they've had time to repent of their crimes, Jason and the Argonauts turn up on their way for the Golden Fleece. They hang around and get all the women pregnant. Hypsipyle bears 2 sons, fathered by Jason, and off the Argonauts go. Hypsipyle, however, is later discovered because the other women hear reports that her father is still alive. She flees, gets sold into slavery, and she becomes a nursemaid at Nemea in mainland Greece. Years later, in another epic cycle, if you like, the 7 against Thebes are passing through Nemea when Hypsipyle bumps into the leader of the 7, Adrastus, and tells him her story. Now, this fundamental episode was certainly the telling of her story was the fundamental episode in the Hypsipyle of Euripides. All later versions kind of seem to depend on that. It runs through the mythography, and as we'll see, that's going to be the center of our study. While she's talking, we're going back to the mythographer now, while she's talking to Adrastus about her long and sorry story, the baby she was meant to be looking after is killed by a snake. They run to the cries of the child, and Capaneus, one of the seven, kills the snake with a spear. In due course, funeral games are held for the little boy. That's the foundation of the Nemean games. And amongst the competitors in the games, lo and behold, it turns out, are the long-lost sons of Hypsipyle herself. So you get the familiar recognition scene in that way. That, in a nutshell, is the story of the Lemnian women. And our Toggle-Tree author tells the story at just exactly this point, when they've left Troy. The lads leave Troy after the insults of Laomedon, and at that point, he tells the story of the Lemnian women. Now, where did he get the story of the Lemnian women from? Well, as I mentioned to you, one of the three Latin epics done into Middle Irish in this corpus is Tugal na Tebe. It's quite different from Toggle-Tree in kind, the story of the seven against Thebes, based on Statius's Thebaid. Now, Statius in the Thebaid put in a reworked and rather altered version of the Hypsipyle story, just as I have told it, very similar to Euripides' version. The seven are passing through Nemea. They meet this nameless nursemaid, get her to tell her story, and she is Hypsipyle. She tells her story, then the little baby is killed, the games are founded, and so on. And that occupies a few hundred lines of the fifth book of the Thebaid. So we have then in Tugal na Tebe a fairly close, partly rationalized, but very much as a decorated and artistic rendering of this episode into Middle Irish prose. The Toggle-Tree author took that section and he took the first person narrative of Hypsipyle in Middle Irish and rewrote it in the third person so that it becomes a third person narrative of all the things that happened on Lemnos, how the Argonauts turned up there, and so on, right up to the founding of the games. Now, it's not immediately obvious why he did this and where he inserted it as he did. Now, to digress a bit, there is always a temptation faced with texts of this kind. There's always a temptation in the community of Celtic scholars as much as of classical scholars to be bewildered by the strangeness of the complex reception of Roman epic and pseudo-history in Middle Irish. And it is very easy to slip into the guess that the author has done it for purely reasons of showing off recondite learning, that the text is like a kind of a snowball that's just growing and growing as it falls, or in other ways, perhaps to minimize its literary seriousness. It's very easy to play it for laughs when talking about these texts to Celtic and to classical audiences, and I hate that. So why is he included at this point? Just where they've left Troy, they visit Lemnos, and then you get the backstory of the Lemnian women before the Argonauts sail on. Well, the reason I think can be understood by thinking in terms of geography, and the detailed knowledge of Mediterranean world geography is going to be very important to us. This, just by way of example, is a detail from the Hereford world map of about 1300. So it will do as an example of the state of the art in medieval geographical knowledge at the time. We won't, although it's very unlikely that the Irish knowledge was directly derived from a map. It's more likely a cosmographic source. So that's the Aegean and the Black Sea there. And just to explain, following the yellow line, the Argonauts started from Athens, where the Argo was built. They stopped off at Troy, which you see there with the castellated building. So that's where they got insulted by Laomedon, the king of Troy. And they're then going to carry on up through the Bosporus and into the Black Sea. And you can actually see the Golden Fleece spread out there at the upper left at Colchis. Lemnos is the island with the quadruped just above it. As you can see, it's right opposite Troy. It is, in fact, the next place you'd get to after leaving Troy. Now, that knowledge put in so many words is not present in Togol Netebe. And I did the experiment of like going around the sources you'd look at, Isidore, Macrobius, Servius on Virgil, Lactantius Placidus commentary on the Thebaid, things like that. And it's surprisingly hard to work this out. Surprisingly hard to work out that Lemnos is the next place you'd get to after reaching Troy, but our author has done that. So it's because the Argonauts reached Troy that the story, they reached Lemnos straight after Troy, that the story is inserted at this point. Now, when it comes to editing this episode, which is maybe about a dozen pages of printed text long, this is what's happened. We have two manuscripts, two principal manuscripts for recension 3 of Toggle 3, D and K, on the lower right there in this diagram. We also have a third fragmentary manuscript, N, which is bound in with a bunch of other manuscripts in the library in Trinity in Dublin. And it's never been published on, it's never been discussed, but I'm using it for the edition, and it is throwing up some remarkable innovations, which I will share with you. Now, it's not surprising with this kind of material to be able to find a new manuscript. Obviously, I was very excited to do so, but there has been so few people working on the vast bulk of Irish manuscripts produced between 1100 and about 1600, 1550, over the past 150 years. It's not surprising. In fact, the new manuscript N was mentioned briefly by O'Donovan in the very first book ever written about medieval Irish manuscripts in 1860, I think it was, 1858. I didn't know what it was. He said, this is the story of Saturn, an Oriental fable. It's actually a fragment of Toggle 3. As I've shown here, it is slightly higher up the stemma than the main surviving manuscripts D and K, and it shows some better readings. So we have those three manuscripts, and at the node that I've indicated as lambda on the stemma, somebody went to the already existing text of Togol Netebe, the Thebes text, and as we will see, he had an earlier and better copy of Togol Netebe than either of the main manuscripts, Ed and Edge, from which that text has been published. As we will see, there are some better readings surviving at second hand in the third person narrative in Toggle 3. And it's here, by comparing a kind of a triangle of manuscripts rather than a pair, that some startling things emerge. Now, this is the way he begins the Lemnian episode. He says, when the ship Argo moved Oportomach out of the port, that is the time and hour and season that the menfolk of the island of Lemnos arrived from the attack on Greater Thrace. So he starts us by saying, when the ship Argo went out of the port, that's the time that the menfolk were arriving back from Thrace. And I say to myself, wait, it's a day's sail, and they must have known this, from Troy to Lemnos. But if the lads come back from Thrace, we have to have time for them to come back, them to get murdered, and then the women to repent of it before the Argonauts arrive. How can you do that in a day's sail? Now, as I say, it would have been easy to say the Toggle-3 compiler has got it wrong. But the reading that I just gave you was from manuscripts D and K. The new fragmentary manuscript N has a slightly different text at this point. An tan rogluishid lang Argo a Port Gorgia amach. When the ship Argos moved out of the Port Gorgia, that's the time when the lads arrived. The Port Gorgia is the port of Athens. So what he's actually saying is that we're now going to go back a bit in time. I've been telling you up to now about how the Argonauts fared when they got to Troy. I now take you a bit back in time to the point when they left Athens. God knows how many days sailing earlier, and that's the point at which the Lemnian men arrived, and then he starts telling the story. So if you were to think of the two places, the two narratives, the Lemnian narrative and the Argonaut narrative as parallel columns, he's brought us back a bit, and then he's going to bring us forward, and it all coheres. Clearly, those words, aport Gorgia amach, were omitted for whatever reason by the copyist at the shared note that gave us D and K, but they're preserved in N. Now, for me, it was the best part of a week's work sorting that out, and it's a salutary lesson that order is always there to be found, and the actual scribes who produce these manuscripts are usually not passive copyists. That's a very important difference between medieval Irish scribal culture and that in most other parts of Latinate Europe at the time. These are Firlean. They are learned scholars who are often creating and recreating and amending and adapting and glossing in the very manuscripts that we have. And something like that may be going on here. Of course, they also omit things and make mistakes. Now, that theme that I'll call it the philological engagement by the scholar authors responsible for these manuscripts is close and deft, and I will say classical. That theme is what I want to focus on in terms of the big picture, the methodological issues that this study raises. Around the time that the Irish antiquity sagas were being produced, in some cases slightly later, in Old French, the Romans d'Antiquité are being produced, many of them on exactly the same sources and with exactly the same spirit of familiarization and cross-cultural transfer, cultural translation as well as verbal translation, although in a completely different idiom and without any obvious point of connection between the two traditions. The Roman de Thèbes, which is also based on the Thebaid Statius, comes together at pretty much the same time that the original recensions of Toggle-3 do. Yet from what I've done at the Roman de Thèbes, there is nothing like the same close historiographical, mythographical, and philological engagement with the verbal details of the original. And that's a striking fact about, I would say, about the oddness in pan-European terms, the oddness of Gaelic Irish learned culture at the period in question, that's to say from roughly 1050 to 1250. Now I want to continue that theme with the experience of reading Statius with the Irish beside you, getting a sense of what the Toggle-Thèbes translator and the Toggle-3 author were doing with their materials. So I'll start with a particularly difficult passage in Statius, where he's using a fierce number of difficult Greek declension words. She's describing all the guys getting killed. Gaias, you get Gian, Greek accusative there. Myrmidones, I saw him fall by the hand of Myrmidone, a difficult Greek genitive. And epopia in the next line is a Greek masculine accusative. In the attested text of Togol Neteba, they've mucked this up completely. But in Togol 3, reading from the new manuscript N, you can see that it must have been, in this case, the original author of Togol Neteba understood the Greek declensions, recognized that Myrmidone was a feminine noun there, and that Epapia is an accusative, the name of her son. It's preserved in Togol 3n, but not in the others. Similarly, there's an extraordinary description of how one of the Theban men is embracing his wife, and she drives in a sword from behind, donex sua pectora ferro tangeret, until she touched her own breast with the steel. So she stabs the sword right through herself, right through him, so that it sticks into her. It's a graphic and typically weird Statian image. The attested text of Togol Neteba misses it completely. You just get, and he received the point in his own body. But the secondary version, preserved in its third person form in Togol 3, gets it exactly. It's thus that he was, his two arms around her, so that she thrust in the sword till she took the point in her body through her husband. And he was even then kissing her with his arms around his neck. That's not based on a reading of Lactantius Placidus's commentary or any other commentary resource available in the period that I can find. It's based on the very difficult linguistic details of the Latin. Now, I just need to go back there. Yeah, there we are, good. This problem continues with the fascinating mythographic conspectus that you get at the very end of the episode. He explains that the snake killed the little boy, and then he says it was left there. They couldn't do anything about it until Capaneus, one of the 7 kings of the Greeks, killed it. And Jove was angry that the snake was killed, so that on that account, a bolt of fire burnt Capaneus at the wall of Thebes by the permission of Jove. Nowhere in the standard version can I find anything like this being said. In the standard version of the 7 against Thebes, Capaneus is killed because of his arrogant, hubristic boasts at the wall of Thebes. In Statius, there is just a hint. Statius says that Jupiter was preparing the thunderbolt, but the god's anger is not great enough, and Capaneus is spared to deserve a heavier missile. Lactantius Placidus' commentary explains, he expands it. He says Capaneus is not struck with a thunderbolt here for this reason, that he'll be struck with a thunderbolt in the war. The Togol Neteba translator almost certainly had a copy of part, at least, of Lactantius Placidus in front of him, and he translated that passage into Irish by saying, yet again in turn, Jove restrained himself until the battle in its turn. Now, the kath there, the battle, the war, it's only clear what that means if you are splicing the different episodes of these two epic narratives together at once. And plainly, the Togol 3 translator, or whoever wrote that mythographic summary there, recognized this idea that the implication of Statius's line at that point was that Capaneus really gets punished for the killing of the snake when he's struck with a thunderbolt, however many months afterwards. For him to have been extrapolating all of that, if you like, mythographic structure out of those few words in his Togol Neteba source until the battle in his turn, What that shows us is that the Tuggle author who gave us the Lemnian episode, or his immediate source, was treating Tuggle na Tebe itself as a canonical text. And this is an indication of the build-up of this set of narratives about the history of the big world, the great nations of the ancient Mediterranean, alongside the Christian narrative and the pseudo-historical and historical narrative of the history of Ireland itself, all of which ultimately come together in a single corpus in the late medieval manuscripts. A new canon is arising. Now, it is purely a contingent accident that the future development of that canon was stunted and really ossified by the collapse of the Gaelic order in the 16th century. To understand it, to do the philology of this, much of what we have to do is to reconstruct how our authors in their time are using the items that, as it were on their bookshelf, reconstructing the learned medieval bookshelf. Whatever they're doing, they're not reading poetry as poetry in the way that anybody does nowadays. They're doing something different. And that's where the prize problem of the Lemnian episode comes in, because at the end of it, the author explains that this is how Statius, the great French poet, he was from Toulouse, how Statius, the great French poet, told the story. But our Tuggle author tells us Virgil and Darius Phrygius and Etna Gothok left it out. And it's true that the story is not in Virgil. The Lemnian story is not in Virgil. It's true that the Lemnian story is not in Darius Phrygius, but who is Etna Gothok? The great Kuno Meyer, in an article that he published in 1915, realized that that name, Etna Gothok, is very like a name that turns up in the text of the cosmographic text of the Ravenna cosmographer, written in the 900s. The Ravenna cosmographer is writing about world geography, and he keeps quoting a bunch of Gothic sources, one of whom is called Aethenarit Gothorum Philosophus. Kuno Meyer, who had just been exiled from Britain for supporting his own country in the First World War, had to write the article without his books in front of him, and he misunderstood the sense of the original passage, but the parallel was brilliant. The name is brilliant. And my colleague Brent Miles has explored this a little bit more since. Meyer thought that the Tuggle author was just showing off when he used these names, that they're not real at all, they have nothing to do with it. However, those who write about the court of Theodoric of Ravenna in the 500s have recently, and of course quite independently, produced the view that in all likelihood there were texts of these several probably Ostrogothic geographers produced at the court of Theodoric in the 500s, and that it's entirely likely that the anonymous of Ravenna, who was writing in Ravenna 2 centuries later, had these texts at his disposal. In that sense, Aethenarit exists, and he is not a philosopher. The anonymous uses the word philosophus where you or I would say kind of learned man or sort of learned writer. Lore master is the translation that I've used. The intriguing point here is that he's a geographer. And as I tried to show at the beginning, the key knowledge that the Tuggle author brought to bear on his materials in order to splice the Lemnian episode in where he did was knowledge of the geography of the Mediterranean islands and where they're located. So I think the more charitable explanation, and probably the more likely, is that either the Tuggle author or the source he was immediately working from knew the name independently of Aithanaret the Goth, and that there may even have been a text derived from him, perhaps a short text about Mediterranean islands, available at some stage in the sequence of lore masters who produced this text. That, of course, is a guess, but I think it makes a more ordered explanation of this intriguing passage than we've ever had before. Now, so much for continuing attempts to reconstruct the bookshelf. The big question is theme. Is this text, this monster of a text, just a snowball, growing and growing as it rolls? Or are there thematic unities in it? In support of the latter suggestion, which I'm just trying to kind of chip away at, in the Lemnian episode, Jason leaves, right? He departs, he leaves her. And there's an ambiguity in Hypsipyle's speech in the Thebaid about whether she went with him willingly or whether she was the victim of sexual violence. The lines, externas non spuntet crimine taidas et tigerim, in Shackleton Bailey's translation, I did not take up a stranger's, is it marriage torches, taidas? Is it a marriage, willingly or with criminal intent, even though Jason was seductive? There's an ambiguity there, there's a question. And in the Irish translation, the language of that passage becomes more unmistakable. Ní dá Joan nó dá cofala faoin rafai leis any his shin. She did not have intercourse with him consentingly or by her own will at that point. She's basically describing being raped. And the suffering that she describes there is precisely consistent with the language used for lánifnis éigna, marriage by rape, which is one of the categories of dysfunctional marriage in the early Irish law text called lánifna. So there's a suggestion then that the translator, shall we say, is drawing the Lemnian episode in because it speaks to the big themes of the Trojan War centered on Helen, the woman from hell, and all the rest of it. And in the prologue of parabiblical material, which I edited a few years back, probably the same author there, or a slightly later one, puts at the very beginning of Toggle 3 an account of the beginnings of the human race, the sons of Adam and then the sons of Noah, which is framed by the apocryphal story that the reason Cain killed Abel was because they were married to each other's twin sisters, and Cain fancied his own twin sister, rather Narcissus-like, and was jealous. This is a very recondite piece of knowledge. We can sort of trace it back to Latin apocryphal sources based from Jewish parabiblical texts. But at the time, I wondered, was it significant that he's starting the whole story with dysfunctional sexuality at the beginnings of the human race? And more of the episodes that I'm studying as I try to sort of chart the unity between all these pendants in Toggle 3.3 seem to be speaking to that theme, and that theme is shared by various other emerging texts in medieval Irish, including Tón Bó Cúailnge itself. So I suppose the kind of meta lesson here is that there are unities to be chipped away at, and there is a complex reflective authorial intention to be uncovered here, which teaches, I think, that in this period, the Middle Irish language is setting itself up as a learned language and should be seen in that way, not as a vernacular. So I kind of leave it on that sort of hanging point, and I'll be very glad to hear what you have to say in response.